Good afternoon, y'all. My name is David Springer, and I am the interim dean of the LBJ School of Public Affairs, and it is my pleasure to welcome our audience and today's speakers to the 24th Annual Barbara Jordan National Forum. For over 2 decades, LBJ School students have honored the life and work of pioneering public servant, policymaker, civil rights leader, and educator, Barbara Jordan, who rose to the national stage from just down the road in Houston, Texas. A friend and advisor to President Lyndon Johnson, she was the first Black woman elected to the Texas Senate and the first Black Texan elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. As many of you know, Jordan ended her remarkable career here at the Lyndon B. Johnson, as the Lyndon B. Johnson Centennial Chair of Public Policy here at the LBJ School, where she taught from 1979 to 1996. That's a pretty good run. Her legacy, fighting for equality, social justice, and integrity in public service, helps to shape and guide the school and its mission. And each year, the Barbara Jordan National Forum honors her memory. This year's forum asks us to think about Jordan's own words. What the people want is simple. They want an America as good as promised. Like Jordan, we at the LBJ School believe that the gap between the promise and reality can one day be closed through our public service mission. And so in that spirit, I'd like to thank all of you for being here today, with a special thanks to our esteemed guest, Eugene Scott, for joining the LBJ School during this important tradition. And with that, I would like to have you hear directly from Aaron Ascajeda, Azim Edwin, Barbara Cuciadin, and Claudia Sandoval, our LBJ School student chairs charged with leading this year's forum. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Dean Springer, for that introduction. And hello, everyone. My name is Aaron Escajeda, and I am a dual master's student with social work and public affairs. I am currently finishing up my degrees, and I am extremely interested in studying the intersect of social policy with immigration and working with refugees and asylees. I've been a student co-chair for the past 2 years with Barbara Jordan, and I'm very honored to continue to teach about her legacy to all of those around us. Claudia.
Thanks, Aaron. Hi, everyone. My name is Claudia Sandoval. I am one of the other student co-chairs for the Barbara Jordan Forum. I am also a public affairs student graduating in May, and my interests really lie in government innovation as a way of achieving equity in our cities, particularly in local government. And really, it's been an honor for me to serve on as a co-chair for Barbara Jordan Week. I've learned a lot more about her and throughout this process, and have just been really inspired by her and the grit that she showed throughout her tenure in public service. So something that I think is inspiring to me, inspiring to anybody who gets to learn about her. Azim?
Hi, I'm Azim Edwin. I am a dual global policy studies and law candidate, and I am interested in practicing international law. Barbara Jordan means a lot to me, being from Houston and being a Black American and African American. Barbara Jordan's struggle and strives are personally important to me and have given me an opportunity to do more in life. So thank you, Barbara Jordan. I'll now pass it off to Barbara Cuciadin.
Thanks, Z. Hi, everyone. I'm Barbara Cuciadin, and I am a second-year MPATH student. I'll be graduating this May. I am very much interested in diversity, equity, and inclusion and how it plays out in the work workplace. So looking at labor relations. I'm so excited to be a Barbara Jordan co-chair this year. She is someone who has really been a trailblazer in the state of Texas and also at the LBJ school. So instrumental to just honor a Black woman who has, gone through the experience and also that has been at the LBJ school. Another thing that's very fundamental and dear to my heart is that she is a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. You can't see my pin, here it is. I am also a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. So very, very excited to honor someone I call my soror. I'll pass it over to Dr. Ruth Wassam.
I'm Ruth Wassam, Professor of Policy Practice here at the LBJ School. And before I came to the LBJ School in 2016, I worked in Washington, specializing in immigration policy, and had the distinct honor of being a very low-level person helping to staff one of the last major things that Barbara Jordan did in Washington, which was chairing the U.S. Commission on Immigration Reform, which has since always been known as the Jordan Commission. So I feel a bit of a connection to the great Barbara Jordan, but it's my distinct honor at this point to introduce the 2021 Barbara Jordan National Forum keynote speaker, Eugene Scott. Eugene is an award-winning political reporter for the Washington Post and the host of the Next 4 Years podcast, which is one of the top of Amazon's original podcasts. He has spent over 2 decades at the local, national, and international level working as a journalist. You'll see him regularly on MSNBC, CBS, and NPR. And quite interestingly, he recently contributed to a wonderful collection that I highly recommend, 400 Souls, a community history of African America from 1619 to 2019. Now, prior to being at the Washington Post, Eugene Scott worked at CNN. He's been a fellow at the Georgetown University Institute of Politics. He grew up in Washington, D.C., but did go to the University of North Carolina and got his master's in public administration from the Kennedy School at Harvard. He has had a full-ranging career, including a stint working in South Africa. And I could go on and on about all the things that Eugene has accomplished already in his distinguished career, but I am just going to stop and turn it over to Eugene Scott. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. It is a great privilege to be with you today, especially given the challenges that so many of you have overcome to get to this very moment. First, I want to express my sympathies to those who are still recovering from the storms that devastated so much of Texas a few weeks ago. And I'm deeply moved by your efforts to push forward academically and professionally through such a difficult time. But I also wanted to express my gratitude to the LBJ School for welcoming me here to discuss a topic of such importance for those of us who are immersed in the work of politics and policy making. And perhaps more importantly, for all of those who will be impacted by our work. I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge just how inspired I am by your commitment to your education throughout this pandemic. The fact that so many of you are navigating such a difficult period so well is an indication that you will be well prepared for the arduous task that will come before you when you enter into the working world. So kudos to you. But more personally, I'm heartened by your desire to engage the world of policy making and politics during a time where the process of bringing multiple perspectives together is perhaps more challenging now than at any other time in recent history. And perhaps it is that makes what we have set out to be and do so important and so critical right now. As was previously mentioned, I am a political reporter for the Washington Post, and I focus on identity politics. Despite identity politics being prevalent across the political spectrum, in recent years, it has become a loaded phrase. usually lobbed against the left from those on the right, who at best believe that a preoccupation with what separates us prevents us from forming the best policies. Personally, I don't accept the idea that identity politics is either good or bad. Identity politics just is. And the fact is, we have decades of data and research and history that show that our various identities often shape our politics and how policy directly impacts us. And perhaps that has never been more clear to many Americans than it has been over the past year, when a record number of Americans across the country cast their ballots for two very distinct visions of America, built on promises playing to competing ideas about what it is that actually makes America great. As you know, we are still within the first 100 days of a new administration. And the early days of any new presidency are often hopeful ones for many Americans, as it is an opportunity to see the country's newest leaders strive to implement an agenda that is ideally in the best interest of all Americans. And that is certainly the case in this moment. The current administration came to Washington with the support of more than 81 million votes, the largest number in American history, and with one of the broadest coalitions to unite behind one candidate. And there's a very real responsibility that comes with that. Promises were made from the earliest days of the Biden campaign, one of them being that he pledged to move away from the divisive rhetoric of the previous president that helped polarize so much of this country. But most of Biden's promises have yet to be fulfilled, which is expected given the time frame, but are no less important, especially to many of the Americans who are looking to this administration to do something that few administrations had done previously: aim to honor the vows of America to as many Americans as possible, regardless of their various identities, histories, or hopes. Or as the late, great Barbara Jordan once succinctly said, what the people want is very simple. They want an America as good as its promises. But we're also in an oddly familiar period where so many of the issues that occupy the minds and agendas of the power players in Washington and state capitals across the country are perhaps shockingly unoriginal. As we speak, more than 250 bills have been introduced in state legislatures across the countries aimed at limiting the voting rights for many Americans. Millions of Americans are still awaiting a dose of a vaccine that scientists say will help lead to the end of this pandemic. And countless families across the nation are yearning for more financial relief from a government that many look to help aid their entrance into a more economically stable existence. How these problems are solved, and perhaps more noteworthy, the quality of the solutions that emerge to these challenges will largely be based on who is at the decision-making table, helping to form policies that consider the diversity of America. It is a time of hope for those longing for a pivot from a largely unpopular administration, while also being a period of immense frustration in a country where too few citizens have confidence in the government, the media, academia, faith communities, and many of the institutions that profess to be invested in the betterment of society as a whole. But it is also a period of unparalleled opportunity for the next wave of policymakers, politicians, media and communications professionals, and other individuals who are in the business of shaping culture using policy, laws, and politics. People like yourselves. Years ago, in a profile of Barack Obama in New Yorker magazine, I came across this quote from the former president where he said something that stayed with me that I've come to believe is essential to being a good policymaker. He said, "I am comfortable with complexity." And the reality is a good policymaker needs to be. This is a big country with more stakeholders and demographic groups that yearn for a seat at the table than many of us can even conceive, and certainly more than most of us have seen reflected at the top levels of government. One of the promises of the current administration has been that they aim to change that. And they've been quite effective already in many ways, having put people in place and marking quite a few historic firsts. But my challenge to you, the next generation of policymakers, is to be mindful of the need to expand upon that work as America becomes even more, not less, culturally diverse in the ways that have unfortunately made a lot of people quite anxious. But fear of what this country could become in terms of diversity will not stop it from becoming what it is already on track to become. And so the call, the demand even for representation and consideration has never been less optional than it is right now. And after centuries of underrepresentation, if any at all, the desire to have the diversity of America considered in how we define a great America is at its strongest. And the comforting part of that is that it's all possible, or at the very least, it's more possible now than ever to hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thank you so much for having me. I look forward to answering your questions.
Hello, everyone. Just a reminder, if you have questions, please place them into the Q&A portion on the bottom of the webinar. The first question that we have for you, Mr. Scott, is, what is the gap between the promise and the reality? Where is the gap between the promise and the reality most evident?
So right now, when we look at the current administration, where it's most evident is when you look and see which voices are present in Washington and which are not. I think a very interesting example of that is when we had tragic event in Atlanta last week, where 8 individuals, most of them Asian, were killed. The Asian American Pacific Caucus in Congress brought something to the attention of many of us that I didn't know was a real issue. There appear to be no senior Asian staffers in the White House. Some in the cabinet, I believe 2 or 3 in the cabinet, but not in the White House as of now. And so it's very difficult to form solutions to problems that are plaguing our society when there's not enough representation and people in positions of power who can help develop some of the answers to the questions that people are asking. That's just one example. And so I think one of the things that people will be keeping their eye on moving forward as we continue to figure out how to fix a lot of the social ills that exist is who is involved in the process, who's making the decisions, and who's bringing their perspectives into the conversation.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point that you bring up. Is oftentimes it takes a tragic event for people to think about what is the status quo and how can we change it. And that leads to this representation that you brought up in Congress and not having members of the AAPI community in senior leadership, which actually leads me to another question that we have, which is, why has it taken so long to build a cabinet that represents the diversity of America, the diversity that we see on a day-to-day basis that isn't really reflected in the highest levels of government?
So I'm going to answer that 2 ways. One, I'll focus specifically on the Biden administration. As you all know, a president can nominate someone to his cabinet, but it's not as simple as that person just arriving. And so we are reminded in this election, just like we were in 2018, that midterm elections are in many ways as important as presidential elections. Because if you want people in place that can help move a president's individuals or nominees, should I say, forward, you have to vote. And you have to get people who share the political philosophy of the president. What we saw in a few cases here regarding the Biden administration is that because there are 50 people in the Democratic side of the Senate and 50 in the Republican side, the Biden administration was not able to get all of its nominees through as quickly as possible, and some not at all. And so that's like literally practically one of the main reasons why it's been difficult to get some people in place currently. The votes just have not been there. Much more broadly, when you look at the history of America, there has not been as deep of a value or conviction among presidents in the past to have as many voices at the table that reflect the diversity of America. We know that this is not something that all individuals deem essential to their administration. to have people of color at the table, to have LGBT individuals, to have women, to have people from other backgrounds, be they various citizenship statuses or when it comes to ableism even. And so one of the reasons why government has not reflected the diversity of America in Washington and in state capitals is it's as simple as some of the most powerful people just haven't viewed diversity with a high degree of importance.
Yeah, I think that we definitely saw that change once there was a Black woman on the ticket. It was a lot more, expecting a lot more of that diversity to be embedded within this administration. You mentioned the AAPI community. I wanted to ask you a question regarding that. Is there a shift or a rise in identity politics among this population? And have you seen any of this? Have you seen yourself some of this rhetoric that Trump had really amplify this anti-Chinese rhetoric that we are now seeing not since the start of the pandemic, that has really amplified since the start of the pandemic?
So I'm going to try not to be long with that question, but there's so many ways I can answer it. One of the things I think is really important for historical context is that while Asian Americans historically vote left, they don't vote for Democrats at the same rates as Latino Americans and certainly as Black Americans. And so after the 2012 election, when Mitt Romney lost to Barack Obama, the Republican National Committee, had this, for lack of a better word, like come to Jesus moment and tried to figure out what can we do to improve our standing with many of these groups we're polling poorly with, including Asian Americans. And Asian Americans in particular were viewed as one of the groups with most opportunity because they weren't losing them at the same rates as they were Black and Latino voters. And so outreach was done from the GOP to Asian American communities, tapping into some of the same values that conservatives have, that we see strongly valued in Asian American communities, such as family values and some of the hard work ethics. But then the GOP nominated President Trump, and that sent a message to many Asian Americans, like it did to many people of color, that having a diverse America was not of as high of a value. And the reality is that President Trump doubled down on that when the pandemic virus started and refused to refer to it very often by its scientific name, despite the World Health Organization and other studies saying this is actually causing harm and this is actually hurting individuals in ways that are completely unnecessary. As a result, we have seen in the last 4 years, Asian Americans become politically activated and engaged in ways that they had not prior to the Trump era. We know without a doubt that one of the demographics that was highly influential in helping Biden secure the nomination is Black voters. But I fear that sometimes the conversation gets too limited and does not acknowledge that it really was a coalition that helped him capture the White House. I believe over 100,000 Asian Americans in Georgia alone, voted for Biden and helped tip the state for him. And many of these were first-time voters. And so that was directly a response to the last 4 years. And so much of the rhetoric and policies coming from the White House towards Asian American communities and Asia as a whole.
Barbara, if I may ask a question right here. Mr. Scott, you briefly talked about identity politics, and can you talk about how America's identity politics went from inclusion to division, and how as policy students and citizens, we can work to unite instead of divide the country? And I know a huge percentage of the country did not vote for, President Biden. So how can we continue to have those identity politics that you mentioned, but at the same time unite everyone?
No, that's such a very important question. The low value of diversity that we saw become, central to the previous administration didn't come out of anywhere. And I think it's so important to have a historical framework. I mean, Trump himself will tell you that many of his ideas, including his slogan, came from the Reagan administration. And so the idea that this pushback to a more inclusive America started, 4 years ago just isn't true. It isn't based on history. But what we did see happen, the way this became so central, what can easily be referred to as white identity politics, was it was a direct response in many ways to the election of President Barack Obama. It was a very reactionary presidency. We have surveys and data. One poll that I looked to very often in the past administration came from the Public Religion Research Institute. And that's where we first heard about cultural anxiety and how many of the voters that backed President Trump supported him out of genuine fear about what America was becoming as it became more diverse ethnically, but also as gender roles changed and as LGBT issues became more prevalent and these ideas about faith and religion were less traditional. There are people who said, you know what, I do not recognize America anymore, and I want to connect with or get behind, should I say, a candidate who will take me back to the America that I long for. And that is at the core of the success of President Trump. That is how there was a pivot away from what at least was an effort from the Obama administration to be more representative to something that was a bit more narrow. The challenge with that, to your point, is we all live and work and breathe in spaces with people whose idea of what makes America great is very different from us. And so there's this idea, I think, that's very unhealthy in some circles that says, ignore these people, do what you want to do, move forward with the ideas and values that you think are best. I don't think that's incredibly winsome. I think ultimately, like, the values that either party has need to be communicated in a way that makes people outside of their tribe believe that those values can help them as well. And so what I would encourage as someone who writes about policy to policymakers is try to figure out what those on the other side of the aisle from you value. What keeps them up at night? What are their hopes and what are their dreams? Present them with what it is that you and your team are doing that speaks to that. Ignoring them does not make them step away. It inspires and mobilizes them. But I think what I would encourage future policymakers, future politicians or media professionals to be mindful of, which is not something I see as much in Washington as I would like, is to remember that this is a big country and there are a lot of people that have to be considered when laws are being made. And too often I feel like that's just not a priority of those who currently hold power.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I definitely hear you about reaching across the aisle. But what happens when our dreams or their dreams conflict with one another?
Right. Yeah. So you reach across the aisle, you're not going to connect with everyone. And so you reach across the aisle and try to find connections with those that you can. But I am deeply aware that some of our core convictions as individuals will always conflict with other people, and there will be no middle ground. But what I would strongly discourage against and what I push back on is the not even trying for bipartisanship at all, because we have data that shows from the 2020 election that most Americans want to see Democrats and Republicans work together. And so you have to, like, I think the idea that you can completely run campaigns saying they are bad and they aren't doing what we want to do without showing that you actually tried. It's not going to be as effective as people want, especially as the rate of people identifying independent completely grows. And there's little decrease in confidence and loyalty to either of these parties anyway.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll ask a question next. Mr. Scott, we have seen political actors incite violence, especially against minorities, and we saw that in Atlanta and a little bit on January the 6th as well. And yet political parties seem more entrenched in their ideology then finding that bipartisanship. What do you think that we can do to hold our political actors more accountable?
To hold them more accountable in terms of trying to find bipartisan opportunities to figure out policy. Yeah, I mean, I think it starts with who you even send to Congress, right? Or who you send to city council. Like there's some new lawmakers who came from districts and their people had no desire to see them actually work with the other side. I mean, as you recall, there's a lawmaker, a very conservative lawmaker who before Biden was inaugurated, pledged to file articles of impeachment against him before he had even become president. And so these are not people in that situation, quite frankly, that will be easy to work with, if at all. But getting people to Washington, getting people to Austin, who work with those on the other side of the aisle starts with who you support when they're seeking office. And if people are running vilifying those on the other side of the aisle and portraying them in ways that don't reflect what they would recognize themselves, you know right then that this is not a person who's interested in bipartisanship. But I think one of the things that's really fascinating, quite frankly, is how often people on the extreme left, and I say that not as a loaded term, but just for the sake of description, are falsely accused of not being willing to work with those on the other side of the aisle. I mean, there are examples of individuals like AOC trying to find common ground on some issues related to higher education, and as well as providing funds for low-income families with those on the right in ways that you wouldn't honestly see acknowledged on Fox News or other conservative media outlets.
Yes, thank you for sharing more insight into that. We have a similar question around voting, more particularly thinking about how partisanship has been deeply entrenched within voter suppression. So our question is, voter suppression seems to be a major action of one of the political parties. How should this be countered by those targeted?
Well, I think one of the ways that it is being countered, and it appears to be effective right now, time will tell, is that it's being called out at a level that it previously had not. Efforts from the Republican Party to make it more difficult for some individuals to vote are not new. These 250 something bills so quickly after an election are at a rate that we have not seen before, but that's in part because we know it is a direct response to the most recent election. But in the past, there have been efforts from the right to make it more difficult to implement more, hurdles once some have to cross or leap across, should I say, to get to the ballot box. But a lot of times those on the left have just ignored it, not realizing and recognizing how effective these things would be. But that doesn't seem to be the case with this go around, and nor does it seem to be the case that people are more afraid of calling out what these bills will do and what the hope and the aim around them will be. And so the only way you can really combat policy and ideas that you think are harmful is to draw as much attention to them as possible. Write about them in your student media, tweet about them on social media, talk about them with people in your community who you know will vote or who aren't voting, and what could the ramifications of that be. And I think we have reason to believe that the progress that many of these party members in these state legislatures are hoping to make will not be as successful as they hope. Some will be, because the demographics of various states make it much more easier for Republicans to get some things through. But I don't think that'll be the case in all places.
Yeah, so a little bit of what I hear you saying is making policy more digestible and more personable to folks so that they're understanding really how their vote is impacting their day-to-day lives. I think that voting gets so caught up in this action of voting, but not really thinking about what happens after that action and how that vote really does affect your day-to-day lives. And I feel like this past election, we got very siloed in terms of this group of people are going to vote this way. Black people are voting because of this, Latinx folks are voting because of this, Asian Americans are voting because of this. And because of that, we saw a lack of, I would say, mobilization in terms of really reaching out to folks. It was more of like, we know these people are voting for Biden. We know this type of people are voting for Trump. But once the election results came out, I think people were more surprised at, for example, the Latinx vote and maybe what that looked like, particularly in the state of Texas. So I just want to talk more about, maybe if you can answer a question or give us a little more insight about why we're missing the different types of folks within a marginalized population, and why it's so easy for us to just say this is a monolithic group and this is always their voting issue.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a very important point. And I think the results of the 2020 election helped us realize that the Democratic Party doesn't have as much of a lock on some of the groups that we historically have thought the party has. And that's for a few reasons. One is because we know that groups are way more diverse than the media portrays groups to be. And so not all Black people are the same, not all Asian Americans are the same, not all women or evangelicals are the same. And one thing that the Trump administration effectively did to increase its standing with the Black and Latino voters, which it did in 2020 over 2016, is attempt to connect with voting blocks within these subgroups that the Democratic Party often looks over. And so you may have seen that 1 in 5 Black men voted for Trump. A lot of the voter outreach from the Democratic Party to Black Americans is targeted at older Americans, is targeted at women, is targeted at very often college educated professionals. It's not targeted at working class Black men who don't have much education beyond high school. And Trump targeted these people. He built, outreach centers in neighborhoods where these Americans are more likely to be. And it worked for him. And I think it sent a message to the Republican Party that if they continue to work to connect with these forgotten voters, that they will connect with them. But it also sent a message to the Democratic Party that you don't have these communities on lock as much as you thought you did. One thing I think President Biden mistakenly did is he often said things like, you all know me, you know who I am. I've been in the Senate, for 30 years. I was Vice President Barack Obama for 8. If you're 24, you don't know Joe Biden. You don't. And even if you're 30, you just don't. I mean, I was 13 during the crime bill. And so if you're already not aware of these moments when a candidate made a name for themselves in Washington, and on top of that, you're getting loads of misinformation, you're not going to go ahead and back the party that, people who look at the data and research assume that you would back because of your demographic group. I personally am very interested in what is going to happen moving forward from both parties when it comes to Latino voter outreach and connection, because I think we've seen, we saw in Florida, we saw in Texas, we saw in Nevada, we saw in Arizona, all of those states did something different, depending on which side you're on, than what was expected because of the diversity of the Latino community. And because our ideas about the politics of this very diverse group that, for the most part, is only united by having ties to Spanish-speaking countries, the diversity of how they view the political world was fascinating to see. And I think there'll be a lot of interest in seeing what happens moving forward.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. We have a question from an attendee. It says, in the episode of your podcast, you talked about the scheme in the GOP and the rise of Trumpism. Do you feel that it is almost like we have 3 main parties now? Or do you think those on the right pushed out Trumpism have found themselves working more with the Democrats?
There are not a lot of Republicans working with the Democrats right now. But I do very often sometimes think there's a Republican Party and Trumpers. Sometimes there certainly is overlap, but if you recall the January 6th insurrection on the Capitol, many of those individuals were very vocal that their allegiance was to Trump. They were targeting Republicans, including Mike Pence. It's been very clear that when you look at some of the voter registration of people who backed Trump, many of them still are independents. And so the future of the GOP is up for question right now, up for debate in terms of how much they will continue to align with the former president, or how much will they try to adopt some type of platform and vision that could be more winsome to many of the groups that they lost, that they were expected to have more support from, such as independent voters or suburban voters. That I imagine varies depending on the state you're in, and especially per congressional district, but it still will vary quite a bit based on how conservative or Trump supporting a state is, and it's not set in stone yet. But I think the midterm elections will be very revealing in terms of helping us figure out just how much of a hold Trump still has on the GOP.
Yes, very much looking forward to those midterm elections. Another question that we have is, do you think that many state politicians running for president, instead of focusing on their own states, actually hurts their party down the ballot?
I don't know how people run for president while holding a job, an elected position, and do that job well. And that I say that regardless of political party affiliation, because being a senator is a full-time job. Being a mayor is a full-time job. Being a governor is a full-time job. How people, lead well and represent well their states while traveling the country, connecting with new people and doing TV appearances and fundraising, it's beyond me. And I've seen it up close. And I think the consensus is that when you are running for president while a governor or while a senator, that you are dropping the ball a bit. And it's just, there are just not enough hours in the day. And I'm surprised, I will say, that most people running for president while holding an elected position seem to, largely escape criticism from their constituents. But there were some examples we heard in 2020 from, South Bend, where there were some individuals who thought that Secretary Buttigieg should remain in the city and focus more on addressing issues with his community than traveling the country trying to win the support of new Americans.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. I have a question related to accountability. We saw during the Nixon impeachment that Barbara Jordan really looked at impeachment as a tool for a good check to the executive branch. And I think now, during our time of social media and just heavy engagement online, we're also seeing, I think, social media used as a tool for accountability from the public to our elected officials. We can look at Ted Cruz's Cancun trip and how that really turned around, I think, his plans because of all the backlash that he got. So how do you think moving forward, we as a general public can continue to hold our elected officials accountable to really reach towards that America that we want to get to?
It's going to be people holding elected officials accountable more than elected officials holding other elected officials accountable. I mean, the impeachment of Nixon was so different from the impeachments of Trump that it's even hard to even describe. I mean, tribalism dominated these most recent impeachment hearings. And the idea that as long as you are on my side or as long as you are not on my side, that will determine how I engage you, appears to be the current approach to these types of situations, and is here to stay and perhaps won't be leaving for a while. Unfortunately is not in the best interest of constituents and works against them. What constituents can do is make it very clear via social media, via their fundraising, via how they vote, via op-eds, via their relationships with people in their community, that these are ideas we support and these are ideas that we do not. I think we have seen what grassroots fundraising can even do on both sides of the aisle in terms of giving people an advantage or platform or access that they previously didn't have. As a member of like the traditional media, I'm always fascinated as a citizen, but also encouraged by how candidates are able to build their brands and get their messages out without going through the Washington Post or CNN. And there used to be a day where that's what you had to do. You only had a few outlets, and if these places wanted you, that's the only time you got to share. But you now can record videos in your living room and put them on social media and connect with people and get fundraising and find yourself catapulted to the top of polls in ways that perhaps people would have never predicted. And that's a really good thing for voters to not be so under the control, I should say, for lack of a better phrase, of the powers, the traditional power structures that have in the past been used to hold politicians accountable, but are decreasingly doing that effectively.
Thank you. I have one last question before we close. I think this one's a little more fun. It's about Barbara Jordan. I wanted to ask you, who do you think is a modern day Barbara Jordan? Who are some of the women who are really trailblazing right now, who have really shown up in the policy arena and are just really speaking out against some of the things that Barbara Jordan also did?
You know, my answers may seem a bit cliche, but like one of the more interesting, newer voices that's very Barbara Jordan-esque is Cori Bush from Missouri. I think her ability to speak for communities that have not had a seat at the table is just groundbreaking and kind of embarrassing when you think about the lack of diversity in Congress. I mean, she is a working class single mom, Black woman from the Midwest. And for decades, if not centuries, policies have been made affecting working class single Black women from the Midwest, but very rarely have they actually been at the table. And so when she's making a point and can say, you know what, this is what I think based on my research, but this is also what I know from having slept in my car. That's just such a very new way, addition to the conversation that we aren't seeing in the past. I think Ayanna Pressley from Massachusetts, in terms of just her personal narrative and her ability to connect with people, in terms of saying, I know what you want and I know what you need because I have come from similar situations, or I have witnessed things that make me believe that, the best way to respond to this is by factoring into this or listening to this or going there. I think her approach to policy making is reminiscent of Barbara Jordan. And I'd say probably two more people, without going on spills about it, are maybe Mondaire Jones from New York and Jamal Brown or Jamal Bowman. I know it's Jamal and it's a B, but he's also from New York. And these four individuals just represent to me communities that just haven't been in Washington. And I think when I think of Barbara Jordan, that's one of the first things I think about. Someone who was at the table and at a table that had not previously seen someone like her at it, and how that determined the conversation moving forward.
Yes, thank you for those four great examples. And thank you for answering all of our questions. Thank you to the audience and our panelists. I am now going to turn it over to Aaron.
Thank you.
Yes, on behalf of all of the student co-chairs and LBJ, thank you once again, Mr. Scott, for your time and for spending it with us this afternoon. We definitely learned a lot, and we have, I definitely was inspired to move forward and continue living Barbara Jordan's legacy in, working with all individuals, but also bringing that important voice to the table of people who are not represented or underrepresented. And thank you very much to all of you who are joining us today. And yes, so have a great day and goodbye.